Right, I think it's 12 o'clock now, and we can start with our today's part 3 with Dan Tasker. Welcome everyone to the third part of our series on quality requirements. If you haven't had a chance to look at the previous videos, please go to YouTube. It will make a lot more sense when you watch those if you are coming to watch this for the first time, just to build your series, to build your knowledge as we're going along, because each 2 weeks, we're building on the knowledge from the previous weeks. So I'm not going to take much more time of Dan. So Dan, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and hello, everyone. So we are at webinar number 3, titled Vocabulary Necessary for Quality Requirements. So we've had 2 prior ones. In webinar 1, I introduced 5 capability types for information systems. And then in the last one, we talked about high-level requirements and how to keep them high level. The one thing we did not discuss during that was vocabulary related to high-level requirements. We left that for this session, so we will start off with that. Our agenda, I'll start with a brief recap based on what we talked about last time. We will get into the concept of a glossary for high-level requirements. Then the majority of today will go into a data dictionary, and by the end of this session, presumably you'll have an appreciation for the difference between a glossary and a data dictionary. And what we look to include in a data dictionary are records and fields, and we'll spend some time talking about what we mean by that and what kind of detail we want. And finally, we'll bring it back around to requirements. So the information that we're capturing in the data dictionary and how that relates to requirements. So to recap briefly, when we talked about requirements in a context, and particularly high-level requirements. So in the last webinar, we looked at a business model that had functions at the highest level, support functions, line of business functions, and management functions. And these high-level functions acted as a context for business processes. So within the human resources function, there were human resources processes. Within a line of business, there are line of business processes. And these processes in turn act as a context for activities. So it's activities that are the things in information systems that we want to provide capabilities for. And so these activities now are a context, one more time, for some IT-based solution. And we said what we're looking at in this series is where we have a project being run that's trying to deliver an IT solution. So what we said is the project acts as a context for our high-level requirements and the capability types I mentioned a minute ago. There are 5 fundamental capability types that are units of delivery. The 5 types are user interfaces, reports, data imports, data exports, and automated functions. As Paul said, if you weren't at either of the previous 2 webinars, they're available on demand to catch up, because we're going to zoom ahead and use those concepts in this webinar and the next one. So when we talk about capability-based high-level requirements for an information system project, okay, the project starts off with an initial scope, comes from a business case that said, well, we have chosen some solution, and we're going to provide an information system support for that. So we looked at high-level requirements for a web-based information system, the TRIPS RU case study, which is the one we're using as examples for this webinar. So the starting point for that project, they said, well, we're going to plan a trip and we're going to make bookings. So these were the 2 activities within the line of business. and we see customers being able to do their own. And we've seen that some of the information comes from a global distribution system, and this system is also supposed to talk to the financial system. Right, so given that scope, the high-level requirement exercise we talked about last time, getting subject matter experts together, and what we're looking for are not just the two activities originally mentioned, but any activity supporting the basic scope of the project that need user interfaces, any reports that need to support those business processes, any data that's available to import, data that's available or needs to be available to export, and if we expect the system to perform activities all by itself, that's that fifth capability type that we called automated functions. So what you see here are the high-level requirements that came out of this discussion. We've kept these, they're all high level because they are capability based, one of these 5 capability types. And so what we have now really is a revised project scope where we're eventually going to get into detailed requirements. So this is what that looks like in the case study, the web-based flight booking system. We now are not only just planning a trip and making bookings, but we've identified some other deliverables, a report, that sort of thing. And we have some new people involved. So that's where we left off last time. When we looked at those requirements, those lists of requirements, they all mentioned concepts that we did not define. So we want to talk about that now, and that's where we're going to use the concept of a glossary. So along with the documented high-level requirements, what we want is a glossary that's going to define the terms we use at that level. So the audience for this glossary and for our high-level requirements is really the delivery team. It's not business users, because business users understand their business and they've given us those requirements, the high-level ones, so they know what those concepts are. But what we want to do is define the major concepts for the delivery team that's going to come along that may not understand the domain as well. So in this case, a reservation system for travel agents. What we want is just definitions. So a glossary really has just terms and definitions. That's what we're looking for to go along with those high-level requirements. So what we want to put in there is the terms related to the high-level requirements. Here they are again. I've highlighted in those requirements the primary information concepts. So we see flight, we see journey option, we see booking, we see trip. So what I'm saying is the business users understand the difference between a trip and a journey option and a flight. But somebody coming to the project, someone that's the BAs potentially, the designers, the testers, may not understand the difference between those things. So this is why we want these things defined in a glossary just for the delivery team. Someone new to the project has high-level requirements, has that scope document, and has definitions for the major information concepts talked about in the high-level concepts. So we want those. We want our user roles defined also. I've highlighted these. So in that diagram, you saw internet user and customer. We want definitions of those. There was a system name, but in the requirements, we actually abbreviated it. So glossaries typically have abbreviations or acronyms, so that GDS, the global definition, the global distribution system, that's one of the users of the system, one of the sources of information. Right. So with that, we can move on to talking about a data dictionary. The data dictionary evolves during the project. As you're talking about detailed requirements for each of those in-scope high-level requirements. So the elicitation sessions are talking to users about functions. As we talk about functions, data is going to come up. So the example we've been using of one of our high-level requirements in the TRIPS-OU case study, a customer shall be able to print a copy of their trip details. So very high level, here's the term trip. It was in our glossary, but we've left trip details for detail requirements. Right, what I have here is a very small version of the trip details. Okay, this is a booking confirmation report. That's what the unit of delivery was. We start to see fields. So while we're discussing this level of detail with our subject matter experts, this is when we're going to start to add vocabulary into our data dictionary. So what are we going to put in there? We want to define records, we want to define fields, and we'll be discussing during this webinar the properties related to those fields. So data dictionaries are all about detail, and that's what we want to achieve. So who does this? It's the BA's primary responsibility to document the needs of the users. So the BA is driving this, but driven based on what our subject matter experts are telling us. The good news is our data dictionary is in the form of a template, and that helps guide what details we want from our subject matter experts. So where do these details go? Details about data, even though we're talking about a report, we're talking about this trip details report. The data we're talking about is function independent. So we will use that same data in the report. That report's got to be there because it came from somewhere else. There'll be some other functions, other capabilities within our system that touch on that data. They're actually the source of that data. So where we want to document data specific needs are in a data dictionary, and that can be either in a template or a requirements management tool. We'll talk about that. Why do we want to do this? These details represent the data that the system we're delivering needs to manage. So again, last time we talked about that context chart showing the activity bubbles in it and the users around it. What I said last time was what you don't see in that is those activities are drawing on data in a database. So our data dictionary is going to be the primary source of detail that relates to what that database needs to look like, it needs to support. Okay, there we're going from here. So the information system data details I mentioned, we're going to talk about records, right? We're defining record as a meaningful collection of fields that's expected to be maintained by the information system. So again, data dictionary will capture details about records. Okay, for example, from our TRIPS-RU, we talked, two of the fields we put in the glossary was booking and flight. So these, from a business perspective, we can call these entities, we can call these classes, but from a business perspective, they think of records. We think of flight records, booking records. So that's the term we'll be using in relation to the data dictionary. The second user-friendly term is field. Again, data, when you're focusing on data, you talk about attributes or that sort of thing. Business users understand fields. Okay, and we've defined that as a business meaningfully named item of data within the context of a record. So glossaries historically are just terms, all alphabetical, one at a time. A data dictionary, what we want to achieve is our fields are not in just one long list, but any field you see is within a context of a record. And we'll show examples of that. I've got a little asterisk here. Oops, no, I've got a example of a booking now. Here are 3 fields. within that booking. So booking number, the date and time of that, and the total fare of the booking. So this is what we mean by fields within records that are going to be supported by the information system, but we're going to document them in the data dictionary. So where I was going with that asterisk, when I say fields, I'm including pointers to related records. And what I mean by that is, for example, we have bookings and we have flights. If we were doing a data model, we would show a relationship here. So we often talk about relationships. Data dictionaries aren't a good place to define relationships. They're the lines. They don't fit. They have things at each end. So a data dictionary is going to use the concept of a field to represent them. Again, in data models, you often see foreign keys as attributes. Well, that's really a field in a record. So what we're going to do is include the concept of relationships as a type of field, and we'll talk about that. So it's just another field within a booking record that the bookings know about the flights. And lastly, when we talk about details in a data dictionary, we have records, we have fields, and then we have properties about records and fields relevant to their being managed by the information system. So here, example of 3 properties for a field. Can it have 1 or more current values? We want to know that. That's one property of a field. Is that field mandatory? So that's an example of a property. And does that field participate in the business identifier? So in our data dictionary, we'll have records, we'll have fields, and for both records and fields, relevant properties. And we'll see what those look like later in this presentation. Right, so I do want to go back for a minute and talk about business views of relationships, because in my experience, business users do not appreciate entity diagrams, and the UML version of those class diagrams really aren't significantly better from a user perspective. So here we have either an entity model or a UML model, however you want it. It would normally be drawn with the entities or the classes. Here are those lines connecting them. And here we have properties of those relationships. The traveler can have belong to one booking. A booking can have one or many travelers. This is what we who understand data models understand. Talking to business users like this, they glaze over. They struggle with process models, data models, almost none. So what business users do understand, and this I've learned over the years, is a hierarchical view. Users are used to organization charts, org charts. Okay, that's a fancy term for a hierarchical view. So you can present the same information to users if you want to talk about relationships, making it look like an org chart. So you show this diagram to a user and they will nod their head and be very happy. Oh yeah, booking. Well, they recognize that bookings can have a bunch of travelers associated with them. And those bookings can also have 1 or more flights. So what I'm suggesting is, if you want to show business users relationships between your records, use a hierarchical diagram. Don't worry about any of these little things. Those properties of the relationship we'll see in the data dictionary. We're still going to capture that. We just don't try to paint a picture for users that includes that. So that we diversed. Okay, so if you look up data dictionaries on Google, you will get numerous examples. Okay, so here's one I found. This appears to be, it was under data dictionary. It appears to be screen. So on this screen, you have types of controls, one that shows some schedule and a name and activity. It seems to be a booking system of some kind. So the high level context is a screen. The next level of context is the fields on that screen. And here you see some properties. So the format, the size, is it mandatory mandatory or not, identifying keys. These are properties we recognize, but in this particular data dictionary. Here's another one I found. This seems to be something about a client. Okay, data dictionaries are often very database centric. So you can see the names here are field names with underscores. They're not very business friendly. The constraint, they talk about primary keys and null values. You don't want to put a data dictionary like this that speaks this language in front of business users. So thanks for the example, but not what we're looking for. This example I found at least mentioned the record context. So what you're seeing here is a list of fields, but the dictionary itself doesn't have a property that associates this directly. It just has a name above this set of fields. And again, we have data formats, field sizes, that sort of thing. Now, this was my favorite. This example belonged to a consulting firm that did business analysis. So this came closest to representing some business related views of data. So what they have here, first of all, is the record context. What in this data dictionary they call a business data object. Okay, well, at least it's not an entity or it's not a class. And then each of the fields within there. And you can see these are sort of business friendly names. They actually have individual IDs for all of the rows in this data dictionary. That's nice. They have a description, that sort of thing. And this data dictionary actually does what I spoke about earlier. This property represents associated business data objects. So this shipping address within an order actually is going to point to another object. So, you know, what I was saying earlier isn't science fiction. There is that concept. So lots of other properties. Here's length, here's a data type, that sort of thing. And away we go. So these are examples of data dictionaries. What I'm offering and what I'm talking about in this series is what I call the requirements in context data dictionary. So this is a template, a spreadsheet-based template that's used in the case study. This is from the TripsRU case study. Here's our friend airline as a record. Here are the fields within a record. Okay, and in yellow here now, here are some of the properties that are associated either with a record or with fields, and we'll look at that. So what I'm saying is there is a data dictionary template available with the case study. You can find that published along with the original articles about the case study on modernanalyst.com. There are references to that at the end of this presentation. So you can find this template. When I finished that series of articles, I had templates for all of those details, but spreadsheet templates being better than texts aren't quite as good as a commercially available tool. So the original series of articles, the requirements in context series in that case study that had the examples all in spreadsheet-based templates, I wanted to see them captured in commercially available tools. So there is now one additional article in that series. It's published with modernanalyst.com. And if you look at the case study, there's a link to that. It talks about commercially available tools. I've worked with 3 of them now. They all support the data dictionary template, and the details we'll be talking about in the next webinar, the detailed requirements. So here is an example of that. So this tool, this is actually Enterprise Architect. Here we have in Enterprise Architect the same information that we had in the spreadsheet-based template. So records and fields. Here's the airline record. Here are those same fields. And I've selected in Enterprise Architect the 2-character code field. Okay, that same information is captured. Here's the definition. And those 3 properties I'm showing you here, can it have more than one value? This field, is it mandatory? Does it participate in unique business identifier. So these are all properties of fields. Here they are in enterprise architect, or multiple current values. No, it can't have that, just like we said here. Is it part of the unique business identifier? No. And is a value required? Yes. So the exact same information captured in a spreadsheet template, which is not bad. It's possible that commercially available requirements management tools can be used to capture those. So that article talks about 3 that have been configured to do that. If you're using one tool other than the ones talked about in the articles, I'd be very interested to chat with you about how that tool can be extended. The article actually presents everything you need to know to do it yourself, but I'd be very interested to prove that, yes, more than just those 3 tools can be used for the requirements in context version of a data dictionary. So all the examples we're going to be talking about today, I used the spreadsheet templates just to show examples of that. The overall TRIPS-RU case study, here's a view of one section of that template. The details in that came from doing detailed requirements for 6 of those high-level requirements that we talked about last time. We ended up in the data dictionary with 29 records being described. You can see these green lines, each of those is a record. Total of 160 fields, all documented in this data dictionary template. So these yellowish line items. So what I'm saying is there are examples after this webinar. You can go and look to see examples of all of the types of data that you can capture in a data dictionary. Right, so that's data dictionaries. We're going to move on in our agenda to talk about records in detail, because those are the things we want to understand, what we want to capture in the data dictionary. We'll talk about 4 types of records in detail. Ones I call primary records, record subgroups, reference data, and something I didn't have a good name for. I just call it other meaningful groupings of fields. All right. Now, in the data dictionary, when you're entering a record, there are common properties for any of the record types, and actually these same ones apply to all the fields. So the columns in that template or fields in a requirements management tool, we want the name of the record, we want its definition or its purpose. If there are any business aliases, it'd be nice to know where data for this is sourced. And again, there are examples in the spreadsheets, and we'll see some more. Who the business owner or owner of that data is, and if there are any business rules specific to that record. These blue properties here, these are really just for managing information in your spreadsheet. When was this entry last updated, who updated it, and what change was. So these aren't really record properties. These are, I threw those in for free. Okay, so primary records. The example from the case study, a booking. All right, what identifies a primary record, the best clue I've seen is that the business gives it an ID, and it's an ID that they actually expose within the information system. You actually use that ID to find those records. Okay. A primary record is typically a context for one or more of our capabilities. So here is that report we talked about, that high-level requirement that wanted the user to be able to print that. Okay, the context for this capability is a booking. And you can see here that the report is a booking confirmation report. Here is the booking ID number. That's a visible ID. They actually print that on the report, so you can use it. Here's one of the properties. And by the way, remember this nice user-friendly set of records we showed. Both of those records are used in here. So travelers, we see them in the report, and flights, this booking confirmation uses 2 flights. This one row here has flight detail. Here's a second one. Okay, and when I said these get reused, the data concepts, the record booking is again the context if we have another high-level requirement about canceling bookings. So we would return to the data dictionary, having put the record in there. When we get to the second one, it's already there. We don't have to add it again. Okay, properties for primary records. So here are the basic ones we talked about a minute ago, and here are some examples. For records, we want to know the current volume, and because this is a new application, they don't have any. We want to know the estimated growth rate. We want to know if you need to archive records at some point and or delete. So these are the 4 properties that go with primary records. We'll see these again. So again, capturing data in the data dictionary, these are not functional things. Archiving and deletion and that sort of thing are actually non-functional requirements. But what I'm saying is these are details we want to get from our subject matter expert. We want to put those details in some place usable. That's our data dictionary. So this is, again, that template has places for all of those. What I mean by a record subgroup, and here's an example here, record subgroups typically are within the context of another record. So you don't go straight to traveler in your information system. You usually look it up some other way. So you find a booking and then you see within that booking a list of travelers, that sort of thing. So record subgroups will not have their own unique business published identifier, but their uniqueness typically depends on one of the parents. So this traveler is unique only within the concept, in this example, of a booking. All right. A subgroup can be the context for further subgroups. Now, normally this would be confusing, but again, we're talking to users about org charts. They have no problem with this. They say, yes, a traveler. Obviously, a traveler is going to have a ticket for one of their flights and a ticket for another of their flights. They're going to have 2 tickets, no problem. They understand that. Okay, properties for subgroups, actually exactly the same as we had for the primary groups. We want to know how many of these we need to deal with, how we deal with that volume, estimated growth rate. All these details are useful for the project for doing database design and dealing with archiving and dealing with deletions. So these capturing this information from our subject matter experts, having a nice structured place to put it, that's what our data dictionary is all about. The third kind of record is reference data. So if I look at a flight record, and here are some properties, 2 of those properties relate to a concept of airline. Okay, well, you have a carrier airline for a flight, and these are the people you buy their ticket from, and the operator of the airline, that's actually who's flying the airplane. So airline would be reference data. So airline would have a 2-character code, the name of the airline. In that report we saw a minute ago, there was a logo for each of the airlines. That's a field within airline. So here's another record, okay? But what I'm saying is these are things we reference in our information system. So they'll often have, rather than a business assigned identifier, they'll have just some unique name or possibly a code. So in this case, the 2-character code is a unique identifier for the airline. These are assigned not by in our system, they're assigned externally. I'll get to that in a second. There's another kind of thing that doesn't look necessarily like a record. There are things in our information system that are label only. So an example, in our trip, we have trip type and a preferred cabin class. So what are these? Well, we actually have in our system label only reference data. So trip type, we have one-way trips, round trips, and multi-city trips. For cabin class, you probably recognize as economy, premium economy, business class, and first class. So we're going to reference values for these. If you think of these like drop downs in a screen, okay, where do these values come from? It's reference data. We want to define that in our system, in our data dictionary. As I said, they can be internally sourced or externally sourced. In terms of airlines, this reference data all comes from outside of our system. We'll import that. Reference data is also typically maintained. We talk about system admin functions. So normal users of the system doing their day job, or users of the sisters, okay, they deal with flights and bookings and that sort of thing. Your reference data, when that needs to be changed or added to, you think of somebody in the back office or far in the back office managing that. So that data is managed in an administrative way rather than in normal business processes. But as it happens, we covered that in our high-level requirements. One of those 11 we had was one that said the system shall be able to request current values for reference data that's maintained in that global distribution system. That was one of our sources of data. So our airlines and several other reference data, we've got a high-level requirement. We're going to have an import function when we look at detail requirements that'll get into that details, and that's exactly where some of this came from. Properties for that, it's good to know for reference data, current volume. For the reference only ones, it's just a handful, it's not an issue. If that's growing, again, for designers, this is useful. Typically, we don't archive or we don't delete reference data. We may update it, but because it's been referenced by live data, we tend to hang on to it. And the fourth kind of thing, these meaningful data groups. Okay, if we go back to our record context, here's traveler. Travelers have a name, they have a phone number, they have frequent flyer numbers. So these aren't atomic things. These aren't fields in their own right. So this is why name is a meaningful group of fields: first name, middle name, surname, title. So this fourth record type, which we want to define in our data dictionary, we define person name, and it will have some fields. And now we can reference it wherever we need it within other record contexts. So phone is another example. If you break phone down into country and area code and phone number, and the reason frequent flyers in there is frequent flyer is a little like a credit card. It's more than just the number. Frequent flyer, you need to know the airline. So this case study didn't use credit cards, but that would be another example of a meaningful grouping. You need the card number, you need the expiry date, and you need that magic secret code on the back. Those are fields all within the meaningful group of something called credit card. Okay, they tend to be these reusable generic concepts like name and phone, but not always. Frequent flyer is very domain specific. These things virtually don't have a business identifier. You don't assign a unique number to a name and then expose it. You are name number 27. That doesn't happen. Okay, and primaries for these, primary properties for these, we actually don't need any of these. So we need the basic things. We need to name this grouping concept. We need to define it. It may have aliases, where they come from, who owns it, and if there are any business rules, but volumes, that sort of thing. These are the same volumes as any record that holds names. So the volume of names is the number of travelers you have. That sort of thing, not an issue. Okay, so that's records, their details and their properties. Let's talk about similarly fields, because we want them in our data dictionary. Okay, and what we said was part of the definition of a field is it's within a record context. So yes, our booking, I showed you a few fields, here are a few more. Okay, we're going to talk about 7 field types quickly. We'll go through those quickly. When I wrote my first book about data, I had 3 field types. Everything was a label, a quantity, or a description. They are still field types in the requirements in context series, but I've added another 4. So in addition, a type of field I call date time. We have true false fields. We have file fields. And the 7th one is our friend, that related record, the one that is a field that points to something else. We'll look at all of these types a little further. When you're putting fields in the data dictionary, I said those properties were common for records and fields. Again, a field has a name, definition, or purpose. Any of those types of fields can have aliases. Typically, the source of a field is the same as the source of the record, but there can be fields within the record that come from specialized users. Again, typically the same business owners. You can have field-specific business rules. Here are our management ones. Properties that are common to all of those 7 field types. Here they are. Again, what record do they belong to? We've seen these 3 in the earlier example. Any field, can we have more than one of these? Is the field mandatory? Does the field participate in the unique business identifier? So for the example of that subgroup, the record, the field representing the record, yes, that will participate in the unit identifier, the identifier plus some others. Do we need history for a field? Labels, we might want to keep it. Dates, we might want to keep it. Relationships, we might want to keep a relationship of that. So yes or no, or some description of that. There are examples in the case study. Besides history, do we need future values? That's a separate property for records. And different from history is, does this field need to be auditable when it changes? That's a typically any field relating to dollars. The auditors will want to be able to audit information systems. So those systems need to keep an audit trail of who changed the record, sorry, not the record, the field, who changed these monetary fields, what was the original value, what was the subsequent value, and when did this happen? So this is a property of fields, typically are quantity fields, the ones that are units of measure. Okay, so looking quickly at those 7 types, the objective of a label, the reason we have label fields in a record is that they're trying to identify that record. They may be naming their record, so our traveler records going to talk about the name. They may be short description fields. Those airline codes are an example of a field that is labeling things within that record. Quantities are there because within that record, we're counting things or we're measuring things. Things have dimensions. All of our monetary things, dollar values, that sort of thing. And you can have a quantity field that's just a factor. So in the case study, the airline case study, children can get a discount if they're young enough. So that quantity field just was a percentage. It wasn't a count. We weren't measuring something. It wasn't a monetary value. You get 50% off or 25% off. Our description fields, the objective of a description field is to capture something that's sentence-based, describing what it is. On the web these days with products, you'll have product descriptions. So there's a certain number of sentences. There'll be a field for product that is intended to capture those sentences. Date times capture a point in time. So when I say time, a calendar date is a point in time measured by calendars. You can have a field there because the record has an effective beginning and ending period. So you can have 2 date time fields, one representing the start and one representing the end. True false is, I find, a very interesting kind of field because the value you record doesn't tell you anything. A point in time gives you a date. A description gives you some text. If you look into a true false field, it's yes or no. It's a binary 0 or 1 or true or false. What tells you what the value of a true false field is the data name. okay, rather than the value in it. So if I have a field called tax exempt with values of true or false, the actual name of that field tells you the value when you look at the true or the false, what's going on there. Files, these now are special format based details. So these are your JPEGs, your images, your audio files, your attached documents, that sort of thing. So a field within a record can represent that. And here is our related records. Their objective is to point us to other records. Okay, we'll look at these again from the terms of specific properties. So the properties I showed you for fields were all applicable to all of them. With labels, we want a minimum and a maximum number of characters. We get that from the subject matter expert. Quantities, we want a minimum and maximum value. We want to know precision. We want to know a unit of measure potentially, and sometimes a quantity field can have its unit of measure in a separate field. I'm going to go through this quickly because we're running low on time. Description, what we want to know from the business user really is the maximum number of words. You could say how many characters there were, but words are more business friendly for descriptions. Date and time, we want earliest, the latest. Precision again, a date you can only want to the nearest year. Okay, a time you want to the nearest minute, even though a system can give you sub-seconds. Scale, what are we measuring it on? Is it typically calendars, the Gregorian calendar, we know when they started. Are we talking about Greenwich Mean Time for if opening hours? And if it's a field pairing, we want the other field. True and false, nothing. File, we want to know a maximum and average number of kilobytes, and you could give a listing of the file types that are applicable. And for related records, this is the information we stole off the data model. The maximum number, we want an average number. Okay, minimum is handled by whether it's mandatory or not. And we want to know what the target record is. So those are the type specific properties. Now, having put all that in the data dictionary, okay, remember that visual I showed you of 29 records and 160 fields. What I want to offer you is a visual index that is not a data model. So here it is. It might look like a data model because it's got boxes and lines, and the boxes represent records and those represent fields, but this is actually a visual index. This is all drawn from the data dictionary. The audience of this is the solution delivery team. I would not show this model to business users. Okay, it's got all the records and the fields that we have in the data dictionary. This particular model comes from the spreadsheet template, and each element in that has an ID, so that was included. These lines, the only lines you see are between primary records and subgroup records. Okay, down here are all our reference records. Here are all those value only records. Okay, if this were a data model, there'd be lines between these and all of the records you want them. We don't need that. Okay, this is just a visual index. All of the details are in the data dictionary. Okay, that's the value only thing we talked about. Right, so Paul, I'm running a couple of minutes late here, but I'll just go a couple of minutes over. We're most of the way through. I said the last agenda item is getting us back to requirements. So we've filled up the data dictionary with our records and fields and our properties. A formal requirement statement, this is an example we used in the prior webinars. We said each customer shall be assigned a unique identifier. Okay, this is not a functional requirement. We're talking about a customer and one of the fields related to a customer. And by the way, we're saying that that customer should be unique. So this is how text-based requirements would capture some of our data related information. What I've got here is the excerpt from the data dictionary. Here is one row of the field ID. It's in the context of a customer. So if we were using the template, instead of writing a textual requirement statement, here is what that would look like. The ID is within the context of a customer, and by the way, that's the name of the field. It's one of our label fields. Here's a definition. It has an alias, etc., etc. Can it have more than one value? No. Is it mandatory? Yes. Does it participate in the unique identifier? Yes. That's what same thing we said in text here. Minimum value really doesn't matter. We want, the subject matter expert said we need identifiers that'll deal with at least 1 million, up to 1 million customers. So that's 6 positions. We don't need history. We don't need future values. We're not going to audit this. So here is the data dictionary representation of the detail in this requirement. Okay, we want to do a measurement of quality because the webinar is based on having quality requirements. So what we've captured for records and for fields, textually self-contained, well, there's no text in the requirement statement because we've put it all in fields. Is it within the level of detail? Absolutely. I would challenge you, what detail should we not get from subject matter experts? Okay, all of those properties represent that detail. What's needed? Yes, we need all of this detail except for the not applicable. Is it about the need? Everything here is about this record. Everything here is about this field. Is it within the project limits? These records and fields are there because the functionality is there. It's supporting those capabilities. Is it a clear representation of the need? Hopefully, yes. It's all nicely tidied away. Deliver the results performed as expected. This is testing. The test team can go in there, find minimums, maximums, all they need there. Have we prioritized these? These actually take on the priority of the functions they support. Shared terminology, that's what we left out for the high-level requirements. We satisfied that shared terminology with a glossary for high-level requirements. Those same functional things from the glossary now appear in the data dictionary as records or as fields. The whole point of a data dictionary, this is our vocabulary, okay? And in terms of the set of requirements, well, the set of data-related information in the data dictionary, there it is in our visual view, it's all there. Hopefully there's no conflicting details. If we have 2 different types of records with the same thing, hopefully that's identifiable as we go. And are there missing details? Same issue we had with function. If the subject matter experts haven't identified fields or records we need, we can't do anything magical about that. So I do want one formal requirement for everything in the data dictionary, a transition requirement. Here's an example of it. It's in the case study. The system shall be able to store, update, and retrieve records and maintain or derive fields they contain as identified in the data dictionary. So as identified in that template, okay? When I say a transition requirement, we're going to have a database designer, a database administrator, take that detail and design the schema. We need that information in the data dictionary before we go live because the developers need it and the testers need it. Okay, there's a chance that there are some derived fields in the data dictionary that can't be supported directly by the database. There may be what I call small c capability development to do field dividing. Okay, here we are at the takeaway points. We've got 3. The target audience for high-level requirements glossary is the solution delivery team members. So we're not writing those definitions for business users. It's people coming to the team. That glossary and that context diagram are their introduction. Business users think of system managed data in terms of records, of fields, and record hierarchies. That's a takeaway point. That's how we want to talk to them. We don't want to talk to them about entities or classes or relationships. Okay, and lastly, a data dictionary template or tool is that's able to fully capture the business details, can take the place of formal data-related requirement statements. So we just saw an example of a formal data requirement statement, that same information and more represented in a data dictionary. Okay, that's it. Sorry, I ran a little over, Paul. This has been the vocabulary necessary for quality requirements. We touched on the quality, we touched on the vocabulary bit and all the details. Next time, we will talk about detailed requirements, and we will see that everything we've captured in the data dictionary is usable in what we talk about next time. Thank you, Paul. Do you want to take the question and answer period?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, for that. Very, very informative. Are there any questions from the users? If you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to ask it yourself, because there's enough that we can manage that. Or if you are a little shy of the microphone, welcome to type it and I'll ask it on your behalf.
So you're saying we have no questions at the moment, Paul?
No questions at the moment, no.
Okay, while we're waiting for someone to type or not type, everything I've covered here today, I've talked about the requirements and context series, but there is an earlier series I wrote called, what did I call it? It's just gone out of my head. It was published in in the BA Times. So it's about quality data. Okay, it talks about those same field types. It talks about associations. So if you want what was covered in this specific one, that was a 6 or a 7-part series. You can find that in the BA Times. Everything in today's webinar actually came from the requirements in context series of articles. One of those articles in the series talks about managing data using a data dictionary. So again, the template we've seen, that was all described in that article in the series. And as I said, tool-based support for the data dictionary. If you're looking for that, just find the case study, and it lists all of the articles in that requirements and context series. The 9th article is tool support for requirements in context, and that gives you the details for how an existing requirements management tool can be extended to capture the kinds of things I've been showing you in spreadsheet templates. Any punters there, Paul, or we can let everyone go?
Yeah, no questions. I think you must have given a very good presentation. Oh, wait, one question came through. I was going to say everyone understood. You mentioned, so this is from Piers, you mentioned EA and the 3 requirements tool. What were the other 2?
There's a requirements management tool called RecView. Okay, that's from a company in Europe, and one called Visure. That's an international tool requirements actually they call themselves an application lifecycle management tool. So those 2 tools, if you there's contact details in that article, the one that describes all those. So the screenshot I showed you today from EA, there are screenshots in that article of those other 2 tools, and there's links to their websites. You can contact them about support. But what I'm saying is, if you have another tool, and in that article, I recommend you, if you're looking for a tool, you do thorough analysis of what capabilities you want in a tool. I recommend you check with those new tool vendors. Do they have extendability capabilities that would support the concepts we've been talking about? So there is a data model in that article that was used to extend those 3 tools. Presumably other tool vendors could use that to extend it, their tools.
Right, I think we're going to end it there. No more questions, and it's almost 12 o'clock. So Dan, once again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
All right, cheers everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone.